All right. So page 5 in your notes. Go ahead and pull out your blue packets. Page 5 in your notes. So yesterday we talked about conditional statements, which would be if-then statements. And we talked about how sometimes the if and the then is implied. So on number 4, I want to look at these sentences. I want to identify the hypothesis and the conclusion of the statement. And then I want to write it in if-then form. Depending on the sentence, sometimes it's easier to write it in if-then form first, and then use that to help us figure out the hypothesis and the conclusion. So let's look at number 4. 4 quarters can be exchanged for a $1 bill. Which piece would have to come first? The 4 quarters. So my hypothesis would be you have 4 quarters. So that's the beginning of my if-then statement, because the hypothesis has to come first. So if you have 4 quarters, if you have 4 quarters, then what can you do with them?
You can exchange them for $1.
Yeah, then you can exchange them for a $1 bill. So I got my if-then written, and I figured out the hypothesis, so now I still need to write down the conclusion. My hypothesis was this part that I put right after the if. If you have 4 quarters. So what is my conclusion then? You can exchange them for a $1 bill. So that's what I'm going to take and write down as my conclusion, except this has to be a sentence that stands on its own. So I'm going to write, you can exchange them. What do we mean by them? Yeah, you can exchange your quarters. You can exchange your quarters for a $1 bill. Some people find it easier to write the hypothesis and conclusion first and then come down and write the if-then statement. Some people find it easier to write the if-then statement and then go back and write the hypothesis and the conclusion based on that, or some combination of that. Like we wrote down the hypothesis first, then we used that to write our full if-then, and then we went back and wrote the conclusion. Let's look at part B and see if we can do the same type of thing here. The sum of the measures of 2 supplementary angles is 180 degrees. Let's see if we can write an if-then here. If what, then what? What would my if-then look like? Close, not equal to, but their sum is 180. But yes, other than that, I loved your sentence. It was fantastic. If there are two supplementary angles, then the sum of their measures is 180 degrees. All right, we got our if-then written. Let's use that now to write our hypothesis and our conclusion. The hypothesis comes after which of these words? In my if-then statement. After the if. So what would my hypothesis be? There are two supplementary angles. Or two angles are supplementary. And now I need my conclusion. That comes after then. So what is my conclusion? The sum of their measures is 180 degrees. So let's write that out. The sum of, I don't want to use there because somebody reading this sentence all by itself would say, well, what's there? So the sum of, what do we mean by their measures? The two angles measures. The sum of two angles measures is 180 degrees. Fantastic. All right. There's a part C to number 4 that's at the top of page 6. So we're going to go do that. And then we're actually going to have to flip back to page 5 to look at something that's written there. But we're going to go to page 6 next. We're going to do part C. A polygon with two sets of parallel sides is a parallelogram. What would my if-then look like? Yes, if a polygon has two sets of parallel sides, then it is a parallelogram. If a polygon has two sets of parallel sides, then it is a parallelogram. All right, let's write our hypothesis and our conclusion now based on our if-then. If a polygon has two sets of parallel sides, then it is a parallelogram. What would my hypothesis be? Perfect. A polygon has two sets of parallel sides. Well, if that's my hypothesis, then what is my conclusion? Oh, I love it. The polygon is a parallelogram. A polygon or the polygon, I don't care whether it's a or the. Beautiful. Absolutely fantastic work. All right. So that kind of wraps up what we talked about yesterday with conditional statements and if-then statements and picking out our hypothesis and our conclusion. We're going to talk about something special that we can do with an if-then conditional statement. We're going to go back to page 5 for a minute. Up at the very top, there's a box that we didn't talk about yesterday. Looks like this up at the top of the page. I can take an if-then statement and I can rearrange some of those pieces, and depending on how I rearrange it, it has different names. So I can take an if-then statement and I can write what is called the converse. In the converse statement, we are going to switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. So converse means to switch. So our original statement, if it rains, then the parade will be canceled. If the parade is canceled, then it has rained. I took my hypothesis and conclusion and switched it around. We can write something called the inverse. The inverse is not whatever my hypothesis is, and then not whatever my conclusion was from my original hypothesis and conclusion. So I'm going to take my original if-then, and I'm going to negate both parts. So if it does not rain, then the parade will not be canceled. And finally, the last arrangement that we're going to talk about is called the contrapositive. With the contrapositive, we want not hypothesis, not conclusion, and then switch. Not hypothesis, not conclusion, and then switch. So basically, I'm going to take the inverse, where I did not with my hypothesis and not with my conclusion, and I'm going to flip them around the other way. I want to practice doing this with a couple examples that are over on page 6. So we're going to go back to page 6. We're going to look at number 5. The tang is a saltwater fish that inhabits shallow coral reefs in tropical areas. Tangs are part of the, not even going to try to say that, family, along with surgeonfish and unicorn fish. All members of this family are saltwater fish. Write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of the true conditional statement, tangs are fish that live in salt water. Determine whether each related conditional is true or false. If a statement is false, then find a counterexample. So here's my conditional statement. The first thing I want to do is take that and write it in if-then form. How can I take tangs are fish that live in salt water and write it in if-then form? I want to write it in if-then form.
Okay.
So if what, then what? Yep. If a fish is a tang, then it lives in salt water. Yes. If a fish is a tang, then it lives in salt water. And they told us up here in this text that this is a true conditional statement. So this is true. If I have a fish and I know that fish is a tang, it has to live in salt water. I want to take now and write the converse of that. What was the word that we wrote down for converse? Switch. So we're going to switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. So instead of if a fish is a tang, this is going to be what? Then a fish is a tang. So what would come after my if? If what? If it lives in salt water. What is it in this case? The fish. If a fish lives in salt water, then what? Then it is a tang. If a fish lives in salt water, then it is a tang. Is that true or false? If you know that there's a fish living in salt water, does that mean it has to be a tang fish? No. So that would make this false, which means we need to come up with a counterexample. That means I need to think up another fish that lives in salt water, but it's not a tang. I don't know very many fish, but I have seen Finding Nemo. There's fish in Finding Nemo, right?
Yes.
Does anybody remember what you call the Nemo kind of fish? It's a clownfish. It's a clownfish. Do they live in the ocean? Do they live in salt water? So I could use that as my counterexample. A clownfish lives in salt water, but is not a tang. All right, now we're going to write the inverse. Converse was switch. What do we do for inverse? Yep, we do not. We're going to leave it in the same order, but we do not with our hypothesis and not with our conclusion. So I'm going to take the original statement. Instead of if a fish is a tang, if a fish is not a tang. All right, if a fish is not a tang, then what? Yep. Then it won't or then it does not live in salt water. All right, so let's think about this one. If a fish is not a tang, so I want you to think of a fish that's not a tang fish, does that mean that it cannot live in salt water? Nope, so that would be false. So I need a counterexample for this. Could I use the same counterexample from before? I could. Or I could think up a new counterexample if I wanted to. They gave us some other kinds of fish up top, didn't they? What were the other kinds of fish they told us about? Surgeonfish and unicorn fish. Are those fish tang? No. Do they live in salt water? Yes. So let's do unicorn fish just to mix it up. I could use the exact same counterexample from before, or I can say a unicorn fish is not a tang, but does live in salt water. All right, and then we just have the contrapositive. What do we do for the contrapositive? Yep, we do the not, and we switch it. It doesn't matter which way you do it. As long as we end up with a not with the hypothesis, a not with the conclusion, and it's switched from our original order. So I'm going to look at the inverse right here because that one's already not. And I'm going to take the hypothesis and the conclusion there and I'm going to switch them around. So instead of saying if a fish is not a tang, what would I want to start this with? If what? Yep. Remember, I want the not in there because this is my contrapositive, so I still want the not, but I don't want it to be if a fish is not a tang. If it doesn't live in salt water. What is it in this case? Not necessarily the tang, the fish. If a fish does not live in salt water, then what? Then the fish is not a tang. Then it is not a tang. Is that one true or false? If a fish does not live in salt water. Okay, so I'm thinking of fish that don't live in salt water. Could any of them be tang fish if they don't live in the salt water? No. So this would be true. All the fish that don't live in salt water, they can't be tang fish because a tang has to live in the salt water. Let's try that one more time. Let's try that with a slightly different example. Does anybody in here play an instrument? Only one person? It's okay. What do you play?
Piano.
Piano, nice. For this example, I want to look at some instruments, specifically some string instruments. A symphony orchestra contains instruments from 4 musical families. So a symphony orchestra, you have strings, you have woodwinds like flutes and clarinets, you have brass like trumpets and trombones, and you have percussion, so drums and xylophones. However, a string orchestra only contains string instruments. The string instruments include the violin, the viola, the cello, the bass, and the harp. Write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of the true conditional statement. If an orchestra is a string orchestra, then it contains string instruments. So this is a true conditional statement. Let's take that and write the converse. What do we do to write the converse? Switch it. So instead of if an orchestra is a string orchestra, this would be what? Yes, if an orchestra contains string instruments, then what? Absolutely correct. Then it is a string orchestra. Is that true or false? If an orchestra contains string instruments, does it have to be a string orchestra? No. What other kind of thing could it be? It could be a symphony orchestra. A symphony orchestra, for my counterexample, contains string instruments. How do we write the inverse? Not. So I go back to my original. I want it in the same order as my original. But instead of saying if an orchestra is a string orchestra, we're going to say if an orchestra is what? Is not a string orchestra. If an orchestra is not a string orchestra, then what? Yes. Then it does not contain string instruments. If it's not a string orchestra, does that mean that it cannot contain string instruments? That is false. Why? Yep. A symphony orchestra also contains string instruments. So I can use the exact same counterexample here. And then with our last couple minutes, let's do contrapositive. How do we write the contrapositive? Not switch. So we put the other two together. So instead of if an orchestra is not a string orchestra, this would be what? If an orchestra doesn't contain string instruments, yep. If an orchestra does not contain string instruments, then it is not a string orchestra. Is that true or false? If it does not have string instruments, can it be a string orchestra? Nope. So that is a true statement. If there are no string instruments, it can't be a string orchestra. Right. That's where we're stopping for today. The homework that you guys picked up on your way in the door is due this Friday. Due on Friday.